Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. For today's episode, we're joined by John Bates, who's curator of birds at the Field Museum, Sushma Reddy, who's Breckenridge Chair of Ornithology at the University of Minnesota and the Bell Museum, and Rachael Herman, Postdoctoral Research Fellow at Stonybrook University. I should also note that Dr. Bates is one of the co-hosts of the excellent Birds of a Feather Talk Together podcast, which I'll link to in the show notes, and you should definitely check out. Our guest today joined me to chat about a recent research trip to the Falkland Islands, and more specifically about the Gentoo penguins they were studying there. It's a great episode with a lot of good discussion about the penguins and also some really great stories about the trip itself. You'll also find some great images from the trip in the show notes, and those are fantastic. Go have a look at them. Before we get to the interview, though, I've got a very small request to make. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a quick moment to give us a like or a rating on whatever platform it is that you use to listen to the show. As silly as this sounds, those ratings are incredibly valuable in helping us reach new listeners, and that's one of our big goals. Thank you. And with no further ado, let's go to the interview. Thank you all very much for joining me today.
Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Okay, great. So we're going to be talking about the Falkland Islands today and a trip there. And I was hoping you could just get us started with a little bit of an introduction to the Falkland Islands. What's that area like? And, what kind of environment is it and what's it like to visit?
Well, it's a set of islands, actually 780 or so, of which two are really big, that are about 300 kilometers off the coast of South America. North of the polar front. We can get into that a little later, which is one of the reasons why we were so excited to go there. And the islands themselves are actually fascinating geologically because they're actually, from a plate tectonics perspective, believed to have started on the east side of Africa and gradually rifted around to where they are in the present day. So they're incredibly old islands in terms of their geology. From the biological standpoint, they're far enough south and isolated enough that they have no native trees. So it's a pretty rugged place, and we had a lot of fun on this trip that began around December 1st last year.
Oh, that's fantastic. So I gather, is it pretty windy there?
Yes, incredibly windy. Probably I think the worst we had, we were on ridges where the weather patterns would just cycle through, and there was in like a span of an hour, we experienced snow, rain, hail, sunshine, wind, and then back to snow. Just insane. And that's the summertime.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty exciting. So tell me a little bit about the trip and, what occasioned it and, how you get down there. Is this do you have to take a ship out there or can you fly in? What's it like?
Well, Rachel has been many times, so I'm going to let her answer this.
Yeah, so the way we go is flying. So we fly from the US down to either Buenos Aires or Santiago, Chile. We went through Santiago, Chile this year. From there, we fly to Punta Arenas, where there's this tiny little flight that goes out of there once a week to the Falkland Islands. So it's a long trek. I think it takes us maybe 3 days of travel. We usually have a layover somewhere. But yeah, there's other ways of getting to the Falklands as well. A lot of tourism goes through there, and by way of cruise ships. So I've actually gone to the Falklands based as a guest scientist on cruise ships in the past, which is a fun and challenging way to get there depending on conditions of the sea. So I prefer to fly.
I think I'd rather fly too. Sorry, John, I cut you off.
Right. So the Falklands is a British overseas territory. So they're independent, but they're part of the Falklands and the part of the UK former colonial pattern, but the airport there is run by the British military.
So 2 years back, we were part of a team that went down to do a cruise from the Falklands to the Antarctic Peninsula and South Georgia and back. So we did this triangle loop. And it was in the year 2022, so deep in the middle of COVID. And so the way we got to the Falklands that year was we had to fly to the UK and take a military transport down to the Falklands. We had to go through every possible testing along the route for making sure that we were COVID negative. And then when we got to the Falklands, they put us, there's a bus that takes you from this military base, the airport, to the town. So they put us on this bus, and they were basically taking people to quarantine. And so for us, instead of taking us to quarantine, they took us onto our ship, and they like watched as we pulled off the dock. And that's how we went through quarantine the first time around. So 2 years ago, we used the Falklands as a place for us to launch off onto this cruise, but we didn't actually spend a lot of time doing research in the Falklands, which is why we went back there this time.
Oh, that's great. And I think that gives us a good introduction to begin talking a little bit about the research. So, what brought you to the Falklands for this trip?
Penguins, penguins, penguins.
Penguins are great. But what were you studying? What type of penguin in particular was it?
Yeah, so the majority of my PhD work as well as postdoc work has focused on the Gentoo penguin, and I've worked primarily with Gentoo penguins in Antarctica, but I've sort of expanded my scope to looking at regional level differences in Gentoos across their range, and the Falkland Islands has a lot of Gentoos, and they're surprisingly larger than the birds that you see in Antarctica and I think in South Georgia. But yeah, I just kind of, it's always been a place where it was like a stopping off point, quick place to go in between my Antarctic fieldwork and leaving the Southern Ocean. And it just became this new unexplored territory for me to look at Gentoo penguins, and I mainly look at their population genetics to see if there's any genetic structure among different colonies, and this can be applied to any area you're looking at. But the Falklands lends itself to being this really interesting place because there's hundreds of Gentoo colonies around very, very, very intricate habitat that really are different. And these two can, add on to that. But essentially, it was the Gentoo penguin that brought us there. Yeah.
Yeah, it was also there's a fund in the Pritzker Museum in the Field Museum called the Pritzker Fund for Meteoritics and Polar Studies. And so we can write grants to them, and they're the ones who funded this, both the 2022 trip to the Antarctic Peninsula and this trip to the Falklands. And, as Rachel's saying, on the Antarctic Peninsula, what she showed in her research was that there's a tremendous amount of population structure down at the colony level, basically, in the Gentoo penguins on the Antarctic Peninsula. So one of the questions that came up over the last couple of years that we've been talking about is what happens in the Falklands, which is a smaller area, but at the same time has these separated populations of Gentoo penguins. And one of the really awesome things about the trip was that in setting it up, it turned out that we reached out to the wife of the captain of the 2022 trip of the boat from the 2022 trip. And they're an amazing couple. He's British, she's South African. It's Alec and Giselle Hazel. And Giselle became the person that organized everything for us. And this to me was one of the more fascinating things about the whole trip, because the Antarctic Peninsula has nobody on it. Once you get down there, you're basically on your own. And the Falklands is a very different place in that sense.
I'll just add, penguins are what got us there. Who doesn't like penguins? Who doesn't want to work on penguin research? But we also use the opportunity to set the stage for looking at other birds in the Falklands, because this is an isolated set of islands. We're really interested in how divergent the populations in the Falklands are from the mainland, from other areas. And there's some really unique forms of birds in the Falklands. And so one way we did that this time was to salvage things that we found dead or were found dead. And that became a little bit tricky because we also had to be careful that this is a season where highly pathogenic avian influenza was still prevalent. So we, tried to find things that we knew how they died, or we suspected that they didn't die of HPAI. But we're trying to continue our research in this area and keep these contacts, especially with these people that we've met and these really enthusiastic and eager people who are interested in studying and protecting the biodiversity of the Falklands. And so we're hoping to go back and be able to do more research and be able to look at more species of birds in that process.
And just to add to that, comparing the Falklands to other places like Antarctica, you have to get like a blanket permit to go to Antarctica through the US government. And then with your scientific permit, you can go visit these colonies of penguins wherever they are. And there's no one there to say you can or can't show up. But in the Falklands, all the land is privately owned. So every colony of every penguin or albatross is on a private land. And you have to get permission from these landowners in addition to scientific research permits to go. So, and at first, I think we found that maybe slightly intimidating, just to see, if, people would feel comfortable having scientists come on their land and interact with penguins. And, there might be some fear of science, but Giselle did an incredible job of contacting people. And for the most part, everyone was very, very, very supportive and excited about us being there. And also every landowner had just a wealth of local knowledge and history of the penguin colonies and what had happened to the land. And it just was so cool to interact with all these local farmers and landowners and build these networks. That I think what made this trip so special for us, because in the past, I personally have never had to do that. And it just made the trip a lot more meaningful.
That's really cool, and that's something that I'd never thought about, the fact that you're interacting with the folks who are living on that land. What, just out of curiosity, what kinds of things do people do for a living in the Falkland Islands? You mentioned the large tourism industry. I looked up the numbers a little bit, and it was a massively larger number of people visit the Falkland Islands than live there. Kind of what are the ways that people make their livings in that area?
So there are about 4,000 people or so in the Falklands, and sheep farming is absolutely the number one terrestrial thing. There in Stanley, the capital, there's people are making their businesses related to the tourism and the boats that stop by. And then there's marine fisheries. And in many ways, there's not much else.
Yeah, I think those are the three big industries. The tourism is in very isolated parts of the Falklands. Like it's either in Stanley, which is the main city, or it's in some of the beaches close by, or the islands surrounding, which have just based on the number of invasive species, might have different types of wildlife in them. But for the most part, the islands are it's one big giant sheep farm. Everything outside of Stanley, which is the big town, is called camp, so it's like the each of the different landowners' areas are different camps that are different farms, and farms can range from. Do you guys remember? It was like 10,000 sheep to like hundreds of thousands of sheep. It was just insane. There was no place where there was not sheep where we went. It was kind of surreal to see, we were just talking about how getting to know people while we were sampling penguins was different, but having to see sheep everywhere we went and
Especially
kind of scaring them off. Yes, we learned a lot about sheep farming.
A lot of slang.
It was
too.
Falkland lexicon. It's really funny. What were
we got to actually
the freshly shorn ones called?
Clippies.
Clippies.
Clippies. That's great.
And we got to see at one of the largest farm on the islands. We got to see them doing the sheep shearing, which is this other thing where you start realizing what a global industry that is. So they bring in sheep shearers from all over the world that are traveling around to different places like New Zealand and Australia over the course of a year for sheep shearing season.
I think
Yeah.
the local record was like 370 sheep shorn by a single person in a day. They're so fast. And they're holding on to these animals and they're barely fighting. You think they're not fighting the sheep shearer, but it was described as a dance. They just know how to hold these animals and shave off the entire coat of wool in one piece. And then
Wow.
on the way, and they pull out the next sheep. And it's incredible. It was just such a strange thing to watch. Just immense respect for that industry and those skill sets.
That is so cool. So I've got to ask a question then. How do sheep get along with penguins? Do they interact? And, and also, I mean, that's a silly question, of course, but like, what are the local attitudes toward the penguins like?
That's a really great question. And there's the history of occupation by Europeans, at least, dates back to the really early 1800s and probably a little before that. And so the sheep farming has been going on for all that time. So in a lot of ways, the sheep have had a major impact on the ecology of the main islands where there are sheep, and that's a problem. As Sushma alluded to before, humans have also bought mice and rats. And so the main islands of the Falklands are missing a lot of the birds that are smaller, just because mice and rats will actually drive them off the island. But by and large, the penguins, as far as we can tell, are pretty much, as we were saying earlier, really respected by the people. And the interesting thing about them is they can be almost anywhere on your farm. So the way a day would work for us, which was so much fun, was we'd get up in the morning where we were staying and we'd meet up with the person who was going to guide us. One of the terms they have in the Falklands is called bogging, which is getting stuck basically in the wet heathland, which is easy to do. And so oftentimes you take two four-wheel drive vehicles with you just so one can pull the other out.
Right.
And this was something that I'd never been involved with before, but was just, it's amazing how well organized they are. But you're basically cross country across this landscape where we would see nobody else the entire day as we were trying to get to these colonies.
45 minutes
Go ahead,
to
Rachel.
3 or 4 hours to get to a penguin colony. Then we're just off-roading, slowly bumping around until we get to where the penguin colony maybe used to be, and then it shifted like half a kilometer.
It was pretty amazing, I have to say that we weren't sure how the locals felt about their penguins, but they all had this real pride, this real sense of knowledge across the years. So they would tell us like very specific details, like, oh, last year they were here, and last year they did this, and last year there were this many, and or several years ago there were this many, and then it went down to like just 10, and a couple of decades ago because of this disease this went around. So they really had this history in their heads that they were so willing to share, and it led us to thinking about what were the population dynamics that have changed over the years that might not be something that scientists have knowledge about, but maybe something that the local farmer owners would know because they are so knowledgeable about everything that's happening, and they have this anecdotal information in their heads that could be really valuable for us to model population dynamics. So it's really interesting. Again, going back to like your question of how are the farmers and the sheep and the penguins getting along. We would have thought before we went there that maybe the fact that these big colonies of penguins that just are taking up space, not a lot of space, but they're taking up space, might be at conflict with these sheep farmers, but they were fine with it. They loved it. They love having penguins, even the ones that tourists never see, right? There's just some aspect of pride there. And historically, people have taken eggs for food from the penguins. And I don't think we met anyone who had done that in recent times.
No, but we had plenty of people who told us how good they were.
We knew people who
Really?
they used to do it when they were kids. So I think everyone, like the people who are like 40s, 50s years old, like they remembered egging at Gentoo penguins as
Mhm.
children. So it's
And
not.
John, John, I remember a conversation where they were like, we didn't really like it, but we had to do it.
but for instance, there was a picture that was probably taken in the early 1900s at one of the colonies that was hanging in one of the bed and breakfasts that we stayed in Stanley, and it was literally these two women in dresses with just several hundred eggs that they'd collected. So
Yeah, it
anyway,
was kind of surreal. Sorry, I was going to add that they were wearing like these nice Easter hats and they were all dressed up and they were collecting eggs from a rockhopper colony. It made no sense.
That's really interesting. I guess that gives us a little bit of a clue as to what the penguins are doing on land, since, I guess we might tend to think of them as largely aquatic species. This is summer, and so this is their, breeding territory, essentially, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, despite they spend so much time in the ocean. That's where they get their food. But they do have to come on land to nest. And like many other seabird species, penguins, they nest in colonies in pretty much the same location every year. And these colonies, they'll have nests that are maybe like at most just under a meter apart, maybe 2.5 feet between each other, and it's just like a lattice of anywhere from a couple hundred nests to thousands. And they do that in order to it's a way of it's protection, it's safety in numbers from predators. They do have a lot of aerial predators, and other birds do depredate on eggs and chicks. They'll scavenge on dead things. So a big colony can alert. There's more eyes, more bills to make sounds and notify everyone or alert everyone that there's a predator around. And yeah, penguins in general, their biology is really really neat. They depending on the species, they do tend to have mate fidelity. So a pair will tend to mate, quote unquote, for life, or for as long as they're able to produce chicks, successful offspring. And so they do take a lot of time uh, prepping nests together, courting, building the nests. They will switch the male and female will switch on and off for incubation as well as brooding and feeding the chicks. So there's always one of the two parents at the colony at any given time.
And
yeah,
I'll add that from a scientist perspective, it was really important that we were there when they were breeding because they do come in a lot of times when they're roosting at night, so they kind of hang out on the beach. But they're on the beach and they can like if they see a threat, they'll go straight into the water, which is what we are to them, right? A threat. But when they're on their nests, they're highly territorial and very, very protective of their young, which works to our advantage when we're trying to prep them to be able to collect samples for additional analyses, like genetic analyses that we're doing. So we take advantage of that biology.
That's interesting. So if you came at a time when they, weren't watching eggs, they would just leap into the sea and you'd never be able to sample anybody.
yeah, and
Yes, we had that experience.
we
Go
did.
ahead, John.
There was a colony there was a group of penguins that we were told about at one of the last sites we went to that where they'd bred in the area in the past and then stopped for a few years, and now they were showing up and they weren't breeding, but they were showing up along the beach. And we got there, and sure enough, there were 50 to 70 birds or so just sort of hanging out on the beach. And, those are really interesting questions. You can't really age those birds. So one guess is that they're younger birds that are just figuring out what they're going to do with respect to finding a mate and breeding eventually. But I wanted to emphasize one of the things about Gentoos in particular, which is just so amazing. I mean, there are these they're, across the penguins, they're king penguins, and emperor penguins, which are the two largest species, and they nest in the middle of Antarctica in the case of emperors, but then king penguins are nesting along these beaches. And then there are birds like rockhopper penguins, which are clearly designed to go up these incredible crevices and get up on these cliffs to nest. And gentoos are kind of, sort of an example of a bird. They do it completely differently in the sense that they'll nest almost anywhere in the Falklands. And one of the things that's really surprising for a penguin is how far inland they're willing to go to put together a colony. And we still don't really know exactly why they're doing that. But we had situations where colonies were 600 feet above the level of the ocean and 2 or 3 kilometers inland.
That's a lot further than I would have expected for an animal that moves as gracelessly across the landscape as a penguin.
And they're also walking to and from the sea every day, several times a day, right? Because they have to feed themselves and feed their chicks. And so they're walking those 3 kilometers back and forth several times a day. It's just incredible what they're doing. So yeah, so we saw things that were high up on the hills as well, colonies that were high up on the hills and colonies that were like right by the water. So, the variance was really incredible, and makes us wonder how, like historically before humans were there and had modified the habitat, how much of the landscape was covered by these Gentoo colonies. It seems like they could have nested almost anywhere.
And one of the things that happened back when Europeans first came is they were looking for seals and sea lions for blubber and oil, and penguins were no different. So they definitely harassed the penguins back then. Did that affect the grand scheme of things? One of the things I was looking at from a historical perspective is Charles Darwin went through the Falklands on the Beagle, and he makes no mention of Gentoo penguins anywhere in his writings. And why is that? And those are interesting questions to kind of mull over and think about.
Would that be a case of Darwin's not having found the penguins notable enough to mention, or were they just not there when he was there?
So it's interesting. He was there in March, which is kind of end of the breeding season. And Gentoos probably don't go very far from the Falklands, right, Rach? He mentions Magellanics, but he mentions Magellanics, which breed in the Falklands, and then in the non-breeding season go up into off the South American coast. He sees them out actually in the ocean off the coast of South America. So some of it may have been time of year.
Yeah, it's strange because Gentoos, they're known to be, as we like to call them, homebodies. They compared to other species of penguins, they tend to stick around pretty locally year round. They don't forage very far out at sea. They tend to stay and get their food closer to the shoreline, and at least in other places like the Antarctic, for example, they tend to stick around near their natal their breeding grounds, or the colonies, and have a pretty localized year-round distribution. So it's surprising that Gentoos weren't mentioned, especially because March, I would assume there's probably some molting going on. So after the breeding season, the penguins go through like a catastrophic molt where they drop all of their feathers, and now they're stuck on land waiting to grow all their feathers back before they can go in the water again, because the feathers provide them with waterproofing. So I don't know what maybe they were high up on the mountainsides and Darwin didn't want to hike to them, and we were the only ones that would do it. So
nobody pointed them out to him. Literally, when we would go out in these days, sometimes we were literally getting to the point where it was, where the heck is this colony?
Right.
How are we going to find it?
And then we'd see like a couple penguins in the distance up on this ridge, and you're like, oh, we see a couple and we have to go all the way up there now. Great. That's great.
So a fair bit of unplanned hiking.
Maybe not completely unplanned, but certainly,
Sure.
it was impressive how much we had to do.
Yeah. Because in Antarctica, and in places like South Georgia, where we've also worked, for the most part, gentoos are a lot closer to the shoreline or closer to the coastline. In Antarctica, their habitat's really limited by the amount of bare rock patches that are available because they can't build their nests on snow and ice. They need to have access to rock and they can build their nests with pebbles. And there's only so many patches like that. So their location, the colony locations are pretty reliable. You can go back to them every year and they're in the same exact place. But in the Falklands, the whole place is just covered in vegetation. There's no snow or glaciers to worry about, particularly in the summer breeding season. So they can really pretty much move and go anywhere. And we even saw like old abandoned areas where they definitely nested in the past that are just like devoid of vegetation because they ripped them up to build their nests. And then you look 100 meters to the left, and that's where they are now this year, ripping up the vegetation and building their nests.
That's really neat. I'm wondering now about, what it's like to get a sample from one of these penguins. You mentioned that they, tend to set up their nest in large groups so that they can protect the nest. How much protection is going on? Are they aggressive? What's the experience like of you found them, you know where they are, you're approaching the colony, are you being assaulted by a bunch of, however large penguins these guys are? What's that like?
I would
Well, they're not aggressive unless you catch them.
Okay.
And the great thing about this time period is they've got young, and so they're really just focused on getting back to their young from the time you pick them up and get the blood sample to the time you let them go. And what I would say is, I mean, I expect any bird that you try to sample to justifiably want to bite you and scratch you. And with penguins, flippers are incredibly painful because they're so strong and they're solid bone, basically. But at the same time, I think they're really fun to handle in the sense that once you get a team, a team of 3 people working towards it, 4 people, you can get the sampling done and let them go, and they go right back to the colony and right back to their chicks and start brooding.
I'll say it was fun to sample with these two. I mean, we had fun with it. It was a lot harder than we had to work to catch these penguins compared to what we did in Antarctica and in South Georgia, because they're just really not that many. Well, there are no land predators in those other areas, and so they're not scared of you. You can walk right up to them, and then they really don't move off their nests unless they have to. So they are really fighting having to defend themselves, I guess, or not wanting to do anything. But in the Falklands, they were a little bit more flighty. They would move away, and we didn't want to disturb the colonies too much because there's always all these predators around, right? There's skuas and vultures and giant petrels, which they call stinkers. They're just waiting to grab things. And Johnny Rooks, which are caracaras that are striated caracaras that are just a little too clever. But we had to we had some funny moments of trying to catch these penguins because they ran away from us a lot more than they did in other places. I have to say here, Rachael is amazing at this. She could run after these penguins, and a couple of times we had to be really clever in terms of how we kind of, worked as a team to be able to grab a penguin and to do it without hurting anyone and not hurting any other penguin or moving any other nest. But yeah, it was definitely quite a process.
We use a long net, on a long pole, like a telescoping pole, that kind of put the net over the penguin to kind of hold them in place, and they get a little confused, and then you can go and grab them and pick them up. It's hard when they already have their eyes on you and know you're coming. It was challenging, as Sushma said, because they were very flighty, and if you scare one penguin, they all run off their nests. So we were sometimes targeting birds that were coming to and from the colony, which is better for the breeding colony, but a lot more challenging to catch them, which turned into three of us triangulating and some silly video footage of me running and failing to grab penguins. We met this other incredible researcher in the Falklands, Amandine Gamble. She works at Cornell and she studies virology and disease in seabirds. And she taught us a really cool method of catching penguins. A long pole with a little hook on the end, and you just sneak up and put a hook around their foot and then slowly pull them out of the colony, which was very humorous. And we utilized both methods. Sushma and I both developed a little tennis elbow from that one, though. So.
I would this penguin elbow.
Penguin elbow, right? The penguin elbow.
Going into the medical books at some time.
That's hilarious. You're getting penguin elbow from an animal that doesn't have much of an elbow. I'm wondering. So you mentioned, getting a blood sample from them. How do you study, penguins? I've heard elsewhere that they're tough to band and recapture for various reasons. What sorts of information are you gathering from them, and what kinds of things can you learn from what you're able to get with these, sampling procedures?
So with collecting blood samples, we're able to extract DNA and then analyze this DNA, and each individual has a signature that identifies them essentially through their genome, but they also have patterns within a colony that, have a signature of, you can tell potentially where one individual comes from if you know what the genetics of a colony look like. And so we can use this data to see how much migration or movement or gene flow there is between different colonies, and kind of figure out this network of how genetically distinct or differentiated they are from one another. At large scales, you can do this, comparing Gentoo blood samples, from the Falklands versus Antarctica, and there's drastic differences, but you can also zoom in and see very, very subtle fine scale differences just by looking at their DNA. And that's something that I'm very interested in, because Gentoos tend to, at least in the Antarctic, they tend to be expanding their range further south and doing really, really well, and colonizing new areas, despite what we know about them, that they are homebodies and they tend to stick around at their natal breeding ground. So there's this push-pull and contrasting behavior that we're observing. And they're still maintaining these genetically distinct units within their colonies. And so we want to see if we can detect something like that in the Falklands as well. And that can help, elucidate the type of gene flow that's going on there, if individuals are exchanging or moving to different colonies, and kind of track that network.
And there is a little bit of modern data where people have been able to get transmitters on, and actually I'm not really sure exactly how they attach those transmitters on, whether they glued them to the tails or something, but there's some evidence from foraging data for penguins in the Falklands that several colonies that they sampled are actually foraging in different geographic areas. And that's really consistent with the stuff that Rachel's found in the Antarctic Peninsula.
Yeah, and you've mentioned several times about them being, a sort of a homebody species. Does that mean that they're less likely than, kind of other penguins or birds in general to, interact with other colonies? At what level are they sort of separated from each other? Is it colony by colony, or is it region by region? How does that sort of work?
Well, Sushma, you should talk a little bit about the 2021 paper that you did with Jane and your students.
Yeah, I was gonna talk about that. So the Gentoos, are found in multiple sub-Antarctic islands like the Falklands, South Georgia, Crozet, and Kerguelen, and other. I'm a little bit fuzzy with the islands that go towards Australia and New Zealand, but they're in all of these little islands that are in the right above, I guess, or north of Antarctica, and as well as the Antarctic Peninsula. And so all of these isolated populations of Gentoos, they superficially look quite similar. And what we did in 2021 was we were collaborating with a former postdoc of mine, Jane Younger, who had used genetic samples to look at the genetic variation across these different populations and found that they were quite different and distinct and had been isolated from each other for several millions of years or hundreds of thousands of years. And one thing we did was we're able to use museum collections to then collect other types of data, not just genetic data, but also morphological data to show that, penguins in South Georgia are morphologically different from the ones in Antarctica and in the Falklands. And so we were able to say that these were different enough based on the level of evolutionary divergence between these populations to call them different species. And so what was previously thought to be one species of gentoos, we revised to say there were four species, four distinct units that were diverging in, long enough to be called species because they had a unique genetic signature as well as morphological pattern. And if you kind of zoom in on that a little bit more, Rachel's work shows that in Antarctica, you actually again can trace how the population has been expanding, and I'll let her talk more about that. Sorry, Rachel.
Oh no, it's just the fact that at that large course, at a coarse zoomed out scale, you're seeing these differences genetically, but even zooming into colonies that are within tens to maybe 50, 60 kilometers, they are genetically distinct enough, or have enough differentiation, despite the capacity to travel that far. It's pretty interesting. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about it.
I'll just add one thing that's cool in Rachel's work is, it would seem like the gentoos, they move around, and maybe they move around from, they start expanding their populations, and it could be, they could be doing this in multiple different ways. But what she was able to show is that they actually have this very it's a stepping stone pattern where they're going from one group where a few of them leave that group and start a new colony. And then that colony gets big enough, and then a few of them leave and then start a new colony. And so it seems like there's this very systematic pattern of how they're expanding, not just kind of haphazardly going all over the place. That could be dictated by the geography of the peninsula. There's only one way to go further south as the ice is the ice cover is getting less and less. Correct me if I'm wrong, Rachel. But
yes. The sea ice dynamics have been changing quite a bit, and we're seeing decline in both the amount and seasonal duration of sea ice, and it's retreating further south, and it seems to be opening up areas of potential suitable habitat that gentoos are starting to take over.
And
I think it'll be
one of the questions that comes out of the population structure and the species designations are how different are these populations that are in the Falklands, South Georgia, and the Antarctic Peninsula. And so Sushma mentioned salvaged early on, and one of the things we were salvaging is eggshells, because I'm wondering whether if you take a good look at eggshells, whether there could be differences in the Falkland versus South Georgia versus Antarctic Peninsula gentoos at that scale. And so, I think there are all kinds of aspects of the biology of these birds which may be pretty similar at some level in terms of what they're doing when they're out foraging in the ocean. I don't think we really know completely about how their diet changes over that area, but there may be other aspects of what they're experiencing in terms of that environment that may show up in eggs, which have to respire during the course of the incubation stage before they hatch.
Yeah, I keep thinking about my PhD research, but for my postdoc, I'm doing something a little bit different. But just to preface this by saying, Gentoo penguins, they at least in Antarctica, they are doing surprisingly well. Their numbers are expanding on the peninsula and are increasing, and they're expanding their range further south. And at the same time, their sister species, Adelies and chinstraps, have been declining, and they're not doing very well. And they're in the same genus, all three. And what we think is happening is that gentoos tend to be very generalist. They have a lot of flexibility in their behaviors, both in the timing of their breeding, their diet. They seem to be, breaking the norms that that the other species are more restricted to. The other species are more specialized. And so for my postdoc research, I am looking at whether this flexibility that gentoos have may be the result of epigenetic variation. And so we're looking at that as well in the Falkland Islands, because I want to see if there is differences epigenetically among these different regions that we find the Gentoo penguin, and if we see more of that epigenetic potential or flexibility on the Antarctic, or if we also see it in the Falklands. Is it location specific? Is it driven by the environment? And just by epigenetic, I mean not differences in their genetic code, but whether certain genes are expressed or not, which can be turned on and off by a variety of different things, including external stimuli like environmental factors. So
that's really cool. So it's a case in which you can sort of by examining their their blood and their genetics, you could sort of see the ways that they might be able to adapt to a wider range of circumstances.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool. I guess I should ask now, what's next for, your research, and, when do you plan to go back and that sort of thing?
So we're definitely continuing to talk to Giselle Hazel about the possibility of when we would try to think about going back. We did one public talk at the end of the trip at the Stanley Chamber of Commerce, and it was a small group of people, and as we've said, it's impressive to realize how much these people care about the place they live, and we think we made the connections now that we could go back and do some more work, and we definitely like to do it. At the same time, this trip where we were able to sample 18 different colonies in 3 weeks, because Giselle just did an amazing job of setting up the logistics of all of it. Rachel's going to be getting some penguin samples as soon as we get all the official in place.
Yeah. We had a total of 84 blood samples, so it was very productive. Just let you know.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, and we were able to, because we had communication with Amandine Gerber, who's been working there too. We'll have access to some of the sampling she did in colonies that we didn't visit, and so I just love the cooperative opportunities that have shown up here, and which is one of the reasons why it'd be super exciting to go back.
Yeah, and the types of questions we can ask can keep ballooning, right? Like taking all these samples from the Gentoos, looking at fine scale patterns, connecting that to what we know about their foraging behavior, what we know about what they do in other areas, maybe what we can get from historical information. But a lot of that will require more funding, grant funding. And right now we're in a crisis of knowing where any of that could possibly come from.
I think despite the funding issues and uncertainty,
Yeah.
I think another reason we want to go back is that there's so many species of birds there, and there's a paucity of studies. Particularly, John expressed a strong interest in the Magellanic penguins because we realized nobody's looking at them, and there's so much to do. Gentoos are really popular, but there's a lot of other species that are can definitely be explored and studied, and there's just it just feels like there's so much to be done and that can be done. And I think the three of us really fell in love with the Falklands and want to keep finding ways to go back and contribute to the scientific community and keep working with the people there. So.
Great. Thank you all very much for joining me today. This has been, such a rich and full research story. I've picked up, a lot of the non-technical science stories have been fantastic to hear, as well as the science itself. It's been great. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. This is awesome.
Yeah, that was wonderful.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.